The door slammed shut. The sound of a 17-year-old girl sobbing, her belly already showing, clutching an old cloth bag, containing only a few personal belongings. In the dark rain, her father's car sped away, leaving a splash of water in its wake. "My daughter no longer exists," were his final words to the building's security guard. Behind, a figure stood silently under the awning. Mr. Brown, the elderly janitor who had witnessed too many stories of abandoned people during his 40 years of service. May had always been the perfect daughter. The only child of a successful Asian family, she had maintained straight A's throughout high school, joined every academic club, and was being groomed for medical school. Her parents had immigrated when she was just 3, working tirelessly to build a life where their daughter would have every opportunity they never had. They had climbed the social ladder with determination, her father becoming a respected surgeon and her mother a pharmaceutical executive. Their daughter's future was the culmination of their American dream, carefully planned, meticulously guided. When May met Jason in AP chemistry, something changed. He was brilliant, but from the wrong side of town, the son of a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep their apartment. May's parents had discouraged the friendship from the start. "Focus on your studies," they had said. "Friends come and go, but your future is forever." But for the first time in her life, May had found someone who saw her as more than a collection of achievements. With Jason, she could laugh, dream, and just be a teenager. They studied together, shared secrets, and eventually, fell in love. The pregnancy was an accident, a single night when caution was forgotten. May had hidden it for as long as possible, wearing loose clothing and avoiding her parents. By the time they discovered her secret, she was already 5 months along. The confrontation had been volcanic. Her father's face turned from confusion to rage to cold disappointment in a matter of seconds. Her mother had collapsed into a chair, covering her face as if unable to look at the shame before her. "You have 2 choices," her father had said with clinical detachment. "Terminate this mistake immediately, or you are no longer our daughter." May had stood her ground, one hand protectively covering her swollen belly. "I can't do that," she had whispered. "This is my baby." The words had sealed her fate. Within hours, her belongings were packed into a single bag, her credit cards cancelled, her college fund frozen. As her father drove her away from the only home she had known, neither spoke a word. The silence was more devastating than any argument could have been. Harold Brown had seen it all in his 40 years as the building's janitor. The luxury high-rise housed some of the city's most affluent families, and from his invisible position, he had witnessed their triumphs and tragedies, their kindnesses and cruelties. At 68, his back ached from decades of bending and lifting, but he never complained. After losing his wife 15 years ago and his only son to war, work had become his sanctuary, a place where purpose could dull the edges of his loneliness. Every day, he moved through the hallways like a ghost, polishing brass fixtures until they gleamed, vacuuming plush carpets, and wiping away the fingerprints of lives that barely acknowledged his existence. The residents nodded politely when they passed him, but few knew his name despite his 4 decades of service. He lived in a small 1-bedroom apartment a few blocks away, left to him by his late wife, filled with photographs of the family he once had. His beautiful wife Martha, his son David in his military uniform, and his daughter Lily, who had been taken by illness when she was just 7. That rainy November night, as he prepared to end his shift, he witnessed May's father dropping her off, saw the car speed away, leaving the pregnant teenager standing alone in the rain. Something about her reminded him of his Lily, not in appearance, but in the vulnerability that radiated from her. The yellow scarf she clutched, now soaked with rain, was almost identical to the one Martha had knitted for Lily before she was born. Some coincidences felt like messages from beyond, and Harold Brown had lived long enough to recognize them when they appeared. May stood under the building's awning, paralyzed by uncertainty. Her phone was nearly dead, and Jason had stopped answering her calls days ago. When she had told him about the pregnancy, he had initially promised to stand by her. "We'll figure it out together," he had said, holding her as she cried. But reality had quickly eroded his courage. His mother could barely support the 2 of them, and college scholarships were his only way out of poverty. A baby would end those dreams for both of them. His final text had come just hours ago. "I can't do this. My parents would kill me. I'm sorry." Rain dripped from her hair as she scrolled through her contacts, looking for someone, anyone, who might take her in for the night. Her closest friends had parents who were friends with her own. They would certainly call her father immediately. Former classmates might offer sympathy, but not shelter. She had always been so focused on academics that she had few deep friendships to fall back on. As the minutes passed, the reality of her situation began to sink in. She was completely alone. Across the lobby, Harold watched her through the glass doors. He saw her shoulders shake with silent sobs as she stared at her phone. He saw her rub her swollen belly with one hand, a gesture so protective and instinctive that it made his old heart ache. He watched as she carefully folded the yellow scarf, still damp from the rain, and placed it around a small ultrasound image she had pulled from her bag. The gesture was so tender, so full of love for a child not yet born, that he found himself remembering Martha doing the same with Lily's first photograph. Residents passed by the girl, some casting disapproving glances, others deliberately looking away. A young couple with a toddler crossed to the other side of the entrance, as if her condition might be contagious. An elderly woman muttered something about kids these days as she entered the building. Not one stopped to ask if she needed help. It was as if May had suddenly become invisible, or worse, a blemish on the perfect facade of their exclusive community. The building's night security guard had noticed her too. Harold watched as the man frowned, speaking into his radio. No doubt reporting the situation to management. It wouldn't be long before she would be asked to leave, policy being clear about loitering. Harold looked at the clock. His shift had ended 10 minutes ago. For the first time in 40 years, he found himself lingering, unable to walk away and leave the girl to her fate. Inside the building, the news of the pregnant teenager at their doorstep spread quickly. Mrs. Hoffman, the imperious head of the Residents' Association, called an emergency meeting in the lobby lounge. "This is unacceptable," she declared to the small gathering of concerned neighbors. "This is a premium residence, not a homeless shelter. We have standards to maintain." Several residents nodded in agreement, their faces masks of concern, not for the girl, but for the perceived threat to their property values and comfortable bubble of privilege. Mr. Chang, a surgeon who lived on the 12th floor, stood quietly at the edge of the group. He had recognized May as the daughter of his colleague, Dr. Zhang. The community was small, and news traveled fast. He knew the story, or at least the version being whispered about in professional circles. The shame of it all, they said. Such a promising girl, throwing her life away. He felt a twinge of conscience as he listened to the others discuss calling the police, but he remained silent. Getting involved would only complicate his professional relationships. The building manager, a thin man with a perpetually worried expression, assured the group that the situation would be handled. "I've instructed security to ask her to leave by 9 o'clock. If she refuses, we'll have no choice but to call the authorities." There were murmurs of approval, discussions of liability and safety concerns, all carefully worded to disguise the simple truth. They didn't want to be confronted with someone else's messy reality. Harold listened from his position by the service door, his mop and bucket providing the perfect excuse to linger. Each word struck him like a physical blow. He thought of his own daughter, of how he would feel if she were standing alone in the rain with nowhere to go. He thought of his son, who had given his life fighting for a country that could be so coldly indifferent to its most vulnerable. He felt a slow burn of anger rise in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. As the meeting dispersed, Harold caught a glimpse of his reflection in the polished marble wall. An old man in a gray uniform, stooped from years of labor, invisible to those he served. But tonight, something was different. He stood a little straighter, his jaw set with determination. His hand slipped into his pocket, feeling the key to his apartment and the worn photograph of Lily he always carried. For the first time since her death, he felt her presence so strongly it was as if she were standing beside him, urging him forward. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the night had grown colder. May had tried calling a women's shelter, only to be told they were at capacity and couldn't take new residents for at least 2 weeks. Her phone battery now showed just 5%. She turned it off to conserve what little power remained for a true emergency. She had no idea where she would go when the building security inevitably asked her to leave. The streets were unfamiliar and frightening, especially for a girl who had led a sheltered life in suburban comfort. 2 middle-aged women walked past, their designer boots clicking on the pavement. Another teenager who made poor choices, and now expects someone else to fix it, one whispered to the other, not quite quietly enough. May flinched at the words but kept her head high. She refused to be ashamed of her child, even as the world seemed determined to make her feel that way. The yellow scarf, a gift from her grandmother before she passed away, was clutched in her hands like a talisman. It was the only connection to her family she had left. A pizza delivery man paused briefly as he passed, his eyes showing a flash of sympathy, but he quickly continued on his way. A young woman, perhaps only a few years older than May, stopped for a moment, seeming to consider speaking to her, but was pulled away by her boyfriend who muttered something about not getting involved. The isolation was absolute, a glass wall separating May from the world that continued to function around her. The security guard approached, his face set in professional detachment. "Miss, I'm sorry, but you can't stay here. This is private property." His voice wasn't unkind, but it was firm, leaving no room for negotiation. May nodded, struggling to her feet, her balance thrown off by her changing body. Where would she go? The question echoed in her mind, finding no answer. The nearest bus stop was blocks away, and she had no destination in mind. Harold Brown had changed out of his uniform and was watching from the staff exit. The security guard was getting closer to May, his posture suggesting he was prepared to escort her off the premises if necessary. Time was running out. Harold's hand closed around the apartment key in his pocket, feeling its weight, understanding the decision he was about to make. It wasn't just about offering shelter, it was about crossing a line he had maintained for 40 years. Stepping out of invisibility and into the complicated lives of those he had silently served. The security guard now stood directly in front of May. "It's 9 o'clock, miss. I need you to leave now, or I'll have to call the police." His hand hovered near the radio on his belt, a silent threat. May struggled to stand, her legs numb from sitting on the cold ground, her pregnant body awkward and unbalanced. Her face showed fear, but also resignation, just one more rejection in a day filled with them. Harold set his cleaning supplies down with a deliberate clatter, drawing attention to himself. He stepped forward, standing taller than he had in years. "This young lady is pregnant," he said, his voice stronger and clearer than anyone who knew him would have expected. "Where exactly do you expect her to go at this hour?" The question hung in the air, simple yet devastating in its moral clarity. The security guard turned, surprised to find the old janitor addressing him directly. In all the years they had worked in the same building, they had rarely exchanged more than brief greetings. "Mr. Brown, I'm just following protocol," he said, sounding less certain than before. Management was very clear about this. Harold took another step forward. "Do you have daughters, young man?" The question was gentle, but penetrating. The guard blinked, caught off guard by the personal nature of the inquiry. "I have 2 little girls," he admitted, shifting uncomfortably. "And if one of them were in this situation, alone, pregnant, with nowhere to go, would you want someone to send her into the night?" Harold's eyes held the younger man's, not accusatory but questioning, inviting reflection rather than shame. Several residents had gathered by the lobby windows, watching the scene unfold. Mrs. Hoffman emerged from the elevator, her face flushed with irritation. "Mr. Brown," she called out sharply, striding toward them. "This is not your concern. Please return to your duties." Harold turned to face her, his expression calm but resolute. "Actually, Mrs. Hoffman, my shift ended 20 minutes ago. I'm speaking as a citizen now, not an employee." In 40 years, he had never contradicted a resident, never stepped outside the careful boundaries of his position. The small act of defiance felt like jumping off a cliff. Mrs. Hoffman was momentarily speechless, unprepared for resistance from the usually invisible janitor. "Well," she sputtered, regaining her composure, "this is still private property, and this young woman has no right to be here. We have protocols for these situations." "Protocols," Harold repeated softly. "Mrs. Hoffman, do you have grandchildren?" The question seemed to come from nowhere, and Mrs. Hoffman blinked in confusion. "I have 2 granddaughters, but I fail to see how that's relevant to this situation." Her voice had lost some of its edge, uncertainty creeping in around the corners of her authority. "If they were standing where this young woman is standing, what protocol would you want followed?" Harold's question was simple, but it landed with unexpected weight. "Mrs. Hoffman's eyes flickered to May, seeing her, really seeing her, perhaps for the first time. Not as an inconvenience, or a policy violation, but as someone's daughter, someone's granddaughter. A woman in the small crowd that had gathered spoke up hesitantly. "We can't just leave her out in the cold. It's going to drop below freezing tonight." Others murmured in agreement, the unified front of disapproval beginning to crack in the face of basic human empathy. May spoke then, her voice small but clear in the sudden quiet. "I'll go. I don't want to cause trouble for anyone." She stood as straight as her pregnant body would allow, maintaining what dignity she could. "I just need one night to find somewhere to stay. I promise I won't be here in the morning." The quiet strength in her voice touched something in those listening. This wasn't a hardened street person or a troublemaker. This was a girl, barely an adult, facing the consequences of her choices with more courage than many of them had ever needed to summon. Harold stepped closer to May, noticing the yellow scarf she clutched so tightly. "That's a beautiful scarf," he said gently. "My wife knitted one just like it for our daughter before she was born." The personal admission changed the atmosphere, bringing a human connection to the standoff. May looked up at him, really seeing him for the first time. "It was my grandmother's," she explained, her voice softening. She gave it to me before she passed away. It's all I have left of her now. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away, standing tall despite her fear. Harold reached into his wallet and pulled out a worn photograph, a small girl wrapped in a yellow scarf identical to May's. "My Lily," he said simply, showing her the picture. "She would have been about your age now." Something passed between them in that moment. An understanding, a recognition of shared loss and vulnerability. The crowd of onlookers fell silent, the tension of confrontation giving way to something more complicated. Mrs. Hoffman looked down at her expensive shoes, suddenly unable to meet anyone's eyes. The security guard lowered his radio, no longer certain of his next action. In that moment of connection, social rules and hierarchy seemed to dissolve. They were no longer a janitor and a resident, an authority figure and a trespasser, just people facing a human situation that called for kindness rather than protocol. Harold placed a gentle hand on May's shoulder. "I have a small apartment not far from here," he said. "You can stay there tonight, until you figure things out." The offer was made simply, without fanfare or expectation. Just one human being reaching out to another. May hesitated, wariness flashing across her face. In a world that had abandoned her so thoroughly in the past 24 hours, kindness from a stranger seemed almost suspicious. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Harold's smile was tinged with sadness. "Because I've seen too many people walk away when they should have stayed." The simple truth of his words resonated with everyone listening. How many times had each of them turned away from someone in need, finding reasons why it wasn't their problem to solve? Mrs. Hoffman stepped forward, her composure regained but her tone different, less commanding, more uncertain. "Mr. Brown, you don't need to do this. We can find another solution. Perhaps a hotel for the night, or—" Harold shook his head. "For 40 years, I've worked in this building, and this is the first time I've seen a situation that needs an immediate solution, not another meeting." The gentle rebuke silenced her, and she stepped back, suddenly aware of how she appeared to the others gathered around them. Mr. Chang emerged from the small crowd, guilt finally overcoming his reluctance to get involved. "I know her family," he admitted. "I could call them, perhaps they will reconsider." He approached May cautiously, like someone approaching a wounded animal. "No, please don't." May's reaction was immediate and fearful. "They've made their decision clear. They don't want me anymore." Her hand instinctively moved to her belly, protecting the child that had cost her her family. Mr. Chang placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes adults need time to realize their mistakes," he said softly. "I have children too." The anger passes, but regret lasts forever. A middle-aged woman stepped forward from the group of onlookers. "I'm Dr. Lawson," she said. "I have a practice in obstetrics. You need to have your pregnancy checked." She pulled a business card from her purse and pressed it into May's hand. "Call my office tomorrow. We'll take care of you." The security guard, who had been watching the scene unfold with growing discomfort, finally spoke up. "I can help get your bag to a taxi," he offered awkwardly, as if trying to make amends for his earlier stance. Harold's small apartment was exactly what you might expect from a man who had lived alone for 15 years. Neat, spare, and filled with memories. Photographs covered one wall: his wife, Martha, smiling from their wedding day; his son, David, serious in his military uniform; Lily at various ages, forever frozen in childhood. Everything had its place, the careful organization of someone whose routines had become a comfort in the face of loss. "You can take the bedroom," Harold said, showing May into a small but immaculate room. "I'll sleep on the couch." He spoke matter-of-factly, brooking no argument. "The bathroom is through there. There should be clean towels in the cabinet." May stood in the center of the room, still clutching her bag, overwhelmed by the events of the day, and this unexpected kindness. "I can't take your bed," she protested weakly. "The couch would be fine for me." Harold shook his head firmly. "Not in your condition. A pregnant woman needs proper rest." He moved to the kitchen, putting on a kettle for tea. "You should eat something too. For the baby." He placed a plate of cookies on the table, nothing fancy, just simple store-bought shortbread, but the gesture brought tears to May's eyes. They sat at the small kitchen table, steam rising from their mugs, an awkward silence between them. "Why did you help me?" May finally asked, the question that had been burning in her mind since they left the building. "You don't know me. I could be anyone." Harold considered the question, looking into his tea as if the answer might be found there. "I know what it's like to lose everything," he said simply. "And I know what it's like to be invisible to the people around you." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "Besides, no one should be alone on a night like this, especially not someone expecting a child." Slowly, Hesitantly, May began to share her story, her strict upbringing, meeting Jason, the shock of the pregnancy, her parents' ultimatum, Jason's abandonment. Harold listened without judgment, nodding occasionally, asking gentle questions that allowed her to unburden herself without feeling interrogated. When she finished, Harold shared his own story, his wife's early death from cancer, his daughter's childhood illness that took her far too young, his son's decision to join the military, and the knock on the door that had changed his life forever. After David died, I thought about quitting, he admitted. What was the point of going on? But the routine helped. Having somewhere to be every day, something to do with my hands. May looked at the old man with new eyes, seeing beyond the janitor's uniform to the life of quiet courage he had led. I'm so sorry, she said, the words inadequate but sincere. About your family. Harold nodded, accepting her sympathy without dwelling on it. Life gives and takes away, he said. The trick is to be grateful for what you had, not bitter about what you've lost. He glanced at her belly. And you have something to look forward to. A new life. May placed a protective hand on her stomach. I'm scared, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to be a mother. I don't even have a place to live, or a job, or any way to support a baby. No one knows how to be a parent at first, Harold said gently. You learn as you go. And as for the rest. He hesitated, then continued with careful deliberation. I have a proposition. You could stay here, at least until you find somewhere else. May looked up in surprise. I couldn't impose like that. And I don't have money for rent. Harold waved away her concerns. I don't need money. But I could use some help around the place. I'm not as young as I used to be, and sometimes the cleaning gets to be a bit much. It was a transparent excuse. The apartment was spotless, but it allowed him to offer help without wounding her pride. Why are you being so kind to me? May asked, tears welling in her eyes. You don't even know who I am. Harold reached across the table and patted her hand, his touch gentle and reassuring. Everyone deserves a second chance. I couldn't save my daughter, but maybe I can help you and your baby. He slid his spare key across the table. Think about it. No pressure, but the offer stands. May took the key, her hand trembling slightly. I promise I won't be a burden. Just until I can find a job and get on my feet. Take all the time you need, Harold said. A baby needs stability, and this old place has plenty of that, if nothing else. His smile was warm, genuine. The first real connection May had felt since her world had collapsed around her. That night, as she lay in Harold's bed, May placed the yellow scarf on the pillow beside her. We're going to be okay, she whispered to her unborn child. We found an angel in an ordinary man. 7 years passed, weaving May and Harold into an unlikely family bound by choice rather than blood. May, now 24, was in her final year of nursing school, her dedication to caring for others born from her own experience of vulnerability and rescue. Sarah, her daughter, was a bright 6-year-old with her mother's determination and a yellow scarf, lovingly repaired by Harold, that was her constant companion. They still lived in Harold's apartment, though it had been transformed over the years. Colorful drawings now adorned the refrigerator, a small desk for Sarah's homework occupied one corner of the living room, and photographs of the three of them joined the family memories on the wall. Harold, now 75, had retired from his janitor position, but found new purpose as grandpa to Sarah, teaching her to read and telling her stories of his wife and children. Their life together was simple but rich with affection. May attended classes during the day while Harold watched Sarah, and in the evenings, May took over so Harold could attend his veterans group or play chess in the park. They had developed routines and traditions that gave structure to their days. Sunday pancakes, Friday movie nights, bedtime stories where all three would take turns adding to the tale. Mr. Chang had kept his promise, reaching out to May's family in those early days. At first, they had refused all contact, the shame of their daughter's situation still too raw. But gradually, small cracks appeared in their resolve. On Sarah's first birthday, a package arrived, a silver bracelet, and a card signed only Grandma. By the third year, May's mother had gathered enough courage to visit, breaking into tears at the sight of her granddaughter with May's eyes and smile. May's father maintained his distance, but no longer denied her existence. When they occasionally passed each other at community events, a stiff nod had replaced the earlier pretense of blindness. May had learned to accept this partial reconciliation, understanding that everyone had their limits and fears. She had found forgiveness in her heart, not for her father's sake, but for her own peace and for Sarah's future. The real crisis came without warning. Harold, always healthy despite his age, collapsed while playing with Sarah in the park. The diagnosis was devastating. His heart was failing. and he needed a transplant urgently. The doctors were not optimistic. At his age, finding a suitable donor would be nearly impossible, and time was running out. May threw herself into action, researching every hospital and transplant program, making calls at all hours. Leveraging her nursing school connections. Sarah, too young to understand the gravity of the situation, knew only that her beloved grandpa was very sick and that her mother was worried all the time. Harold, ever practical, began putting his affairs in order. He updated his will, leaving the apartment to May and Sarah. He organized his photographs and mementos, labeling each one so the stories wouldn't be lost. He wrote letters to both May and Sarah, to be opened after he was gone. Through it all, he maintained a quiet dignity, concerned more about the impact his death would have on them than about his own fear. Then came the unexpected twist. May's father appeared at the hospital one afternoon, stiff and formal in his surgeon's coat but undeniably present. He approached Harold's bed with measured steps, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Brown," he said, his voice carrying the slight accent of his homeland. "I believe I owe you a debt that can never be repaid." The words seemed to cost him, each one carefully chosen. "You did what I could not, you cared for my daughter when she needed it most." Harold, weak but alert, studied the man's face. "She's an extraordinary young woman," he said simply. "You should be very proud of her." A flicker of emotion crossed the doctor's face. Regret, perhaps, or shame. "I am," he admitted, the first acknowledgement of his feelings in 7 years. "And of my granddaughter as well." He straightened, reverting to his professional demeanor. "I have reviewed your case, Mr. Brown. With your permission, I would like to take over as your primary physician and explore some additional treatment options." May was stunned by her father's appearance and even more by his offer. "Why now?" she asked when they were alone in the hallway. "After all this time, why do you suddenly care?" Her father looked at her directly for the first time in years. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "we must lose something precious to recognize its value." He hesitated, then added, "I have made many mistakes. I cannot undo them, but perhaps I can prevent another one." True to his word, May's father used every resource at his disposal, his professional connections, his influence, even his considerable financial means, to move Harold's name up the transplant list, and to ensure he received the best possible care. It was a gesture that spoke louder than any apology could have. An acknowledgement of the debt he owed to the man who had become a father to his daughter when he had failed her. Against all odds, a matching donor heart was found. When the nurse shared the news, she mentioned only that it had come from a young soldier who had died in a training accident. Harold, drifting in and out of consciousness as they prepared him for surgery, was struck by the coincidence, a soldier's heart, like his son's had been. He wondered briefly if David, wherever he was, had somehow engineered this miracle. The surgery was long and dangerous, especially for a patient of Harold's age, but successful beyond the doctor's expectations. When he finally awoke, groggy and weak but alive, his first words were curious. "This heart feels familiar," he whispered to May, who had not left his side. "Like it belongs here." Recovery was slow but steady. Harold regained his strength gradually, each day bringing small improvements. Sarah appointed herself his special nurse, bringing him water and reading to him from her school books, her presence a more powerful medicine than anything the hospital could provide. As Harold grew stronger, May's relationship with her father began to thaw. It would never be what it once was. Too much had happened, too many harsh words had been spoken. But a new connection formed, based not on authority and obedience but on mutual respect and the shared love for Sarah. 1 year after the transplant, they celebrated with a small gathering in the park: Harold, May, Sarah, and, somewhat awkwardly, May's parents. As the adults made strained conversation, Sarah ran off to play, her yellow scarf streaming behind her like a banner of hope. Harold watched her, his new heart full of gratitude for this unexpected second chance at family. "You know," he said to May as they sat on a bench together, "when I took you in that night, I thought I was saving your life." He smiled, watching Sarah climb the jungle gym with fearless determination. "I never realized you would end up saving mine." May slipped her hand into his, the gesture as natural as breathing. "That's what family does," she said simply. "We save each other, again and again." She looked over at her father, who was watching Sarah with an expression of wonder, perhaps seeing for the first time all that he had nearly lost. Some wounds might never fully heal, but new growth was possible even in the most damaged soil. As the afternoon light turned golden, Sarah ran back to them, her cheeks flushed with exertion and joy. She threw herself onto the bench between Harold and May, the yellow scarf still wrapped securely around her neck despite the warm day. "Grandpa," she said, leaning against Harold's side, "tell me again about the yellow scarf, and how we became a family." Harold exchanged a glance with May, both of them smiling at the familiar request. Well, he began. His voice stronger now than it had been in years. It all started on a rainy night, when two lost souls found each other under an awning. The story continued, as it would for years to come, not a fairy tale of perfect endings, but a true story of imperfect people finding their way back to what matters most. In a world that too often looked away from pain, they had learned to look directly at it, and in doing so, had found the courage to begin again.